Elias Brennan stood in snow up to his knees, pulling an ice saw through a frozen oak log, while his neighbor watched from 50 yards away, shaking his head in disgust. What that neighbor didn't know was that the technique Elias had spent an entire autumn perfecting would save his own family's life before winter ended. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity speak to you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's story might be the most unbelievable one yet. The year was 1843. The Appalachian Mountains of western Virginia held winter in a grip so tight that even experienced mountaineers talked about it with respect, bordering on fear. January had brought temperatures that turned breath to ice crystals before it left a man's lungs. Snow lay 4 feet deep in the valleys and deeper in the hollows where wind piled it against the hillsides. And every family living in those remote mountains faced the same daily battle, processing enough firewood to survive until morning. Elias Brennan was 34 years old that winter. He had lived in the mountains for 11 years, having moved west from the Virginia Piedmont after his father's farm failed during the Depression of 1837. He was competent with an axe, capable with a rifle, and careful enough to have survived more than a decade in country that killed careless men with efficient regularity. He was not particularly innovative. He was not known for unusual thinking. He simply did what mountain life required and did it well enough to stay alive. His cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a creek that wound through a narrow valley. The location gave him access to water, timber, and a few beaver ponds that still held animals worth trapping. He lived alone, though he maintained friendly relations with the scattered families who occupied the surrounding mountains. The nearest neighbor was Thomas Kern, a German immigrant who had settled 3 miles downstream with his wife and 2 children. Thomas and Elias helped each other occasionally with tasks that required 2 men, raising roof beams, moving heavy logs, butchering large game. On the 14th of January, 1843, both men were working their wood piles. Winter in the Appalachians meant constant wood processing. A family burned through enormous quantities of firewood simply maintaining enough heat to prevent freezing. The cold was relentless and unforgiving. Let your fire die overnight, and you might not wake up. Run out of split wood during a storm, and you faced a choice between freezing indoors or risking exposure outdoors to process more. The work itself was brutal when temperatures dropped below freezing for extended periods. Green wood cut in autumn and stacked for seasoning would freeze solid when winter cold penetrated deep enough. The moisture in the wood fibers turned to ice, transforming normal timber into something that resisted. Cutting with almost malicious efficiency, axes bounced off frozen logs, the impact jarring a man's shoulders and wrists. Each swing that failed to bite deep meant wasted energy. Each wasted swing brought exhaustion closer. And exhaustion in mountain winters killed as surely as bears or falls. Elias spent that morning working through his supply of oak logs. Each piece had been cut the previous autumn and stacked near his cabin. Now they were frozen, nearly solid. His axe rang against the wood with a sound like iron striking stone. 2 weeks passed. Elias continued his daily routine of wood processing, trap checking, and basic survival maintenance. The cold held without breaking. On the morning of January 28th, he woke to the sound of shouting carrying across the frozen landscape from the direction of Thomas Kern's property. The distance was considerable, nearly 3 miles, but sound traveled with strange clarity in the cold air. Elias grabbed his rifle and headed downstream along the creek. He found Thomas Kern collapsed in the snow 30 yards from his cabin. The man was conscious but shaking violently. His left leg showed blood soaking through his wool trousers. His face had the grayish pallor that meant hypothermia had advanced beyond the early stages. Around him lay scattered wood chips and a hand axe buried blade deep in a half-split log. The story was clear enough even before Thomas tried to explain through chattering teeth. Thomas had been working alone for 3 days straight, trying to process enough frozen wood to refill his depleted supply. His wife Anna had been sick with fever. His children were too young to help with the heavy work. He had pushed himself past reasonable limits, swinging the axe hour after hour against logs that barely showed the impacts. Exhaustion had dulled his coordination. A swing aimed at a frozen oak round had glanced off the rock-hard surface. The axe head had deflected downward and struck his leg just above the ankle, cutting deep through the muscle. The injury alone was serious but survivable. What made it fatal was what happened next. Unable to put weight on the damaged leg, Thomas had tried to crawl back to his cabin. The distance was only 30 yards, but crawling through deep snow while bleeding drained his strength and body heat simultaneously. He had made it halfway before his body began shutting down. By the time Elias found him, Thomas had been lying in the snow for nearly an hour. Elias got Thomas inside the cabin. He built up the fire, wrapped the injured man in every blanket the household owned, and tried to stop the bleeding. Anna Kern, still weak with fever herself, did what she could to help. But the damage was already done. Hypothermia had progressed too far. Thomas's core temperature had dropped below the point where the body could generate enough heat to recover. He died that evening with his wife holding one hand and Elias holding the other. The funeral took place 3 days later on a hillside above the Kern cabin. 6 families from the surrounding mountains attended, as many as could travel through the deep snow. The preacher who rode a circuit through the isolated communities happened to be in the area. He spoke about the hardships of mountain life and the courage required to face them. He called Thomas's death a tragedy, but also part of God's plan. Elias listened and said nothing. The other mourners nodded and accepted the words. This was mountain life. Men died from accidents, weather, disease, and simple bad luck. You buried them, helped their families if possible, and moved on. Anna Kern and her children left the mountains a week after the funeral. She had family in the valley near Staunton who could take them in. Elias helped them pack what they could carry and watched them depart down the narrow mountain trail. The cabin would sit empty until spring, when someone else might claim it. That was how things worked in the mountains. Life moved forward because it had to. But Elias could not move forward as easily as the others. He kept seeing Thomas collapsed in the snow. He kept thinking about the 3 days of exhausting, dangerous work that had killed his neighbor as surely as the axe wound itself. The accepted wisdom was that winter woodcutting was simply hard and hazardous. You did it because you had to. You risked injury and exhaustion because the alternative was freezing to death. That was the reality every mountaineer faced. Elias found himself questioning that reality. There had to be a better method. The problem was not the cold itself, but how the cold changed the wood. Frozen timber became a different material entirely. The tools and techniques that worked on normal wood failed on frozen logs. Everyone knew this. Everyone accepted it. But acceptance did not make it less deadly. In mid-February, Elias traveled to Lexington to sell furs and purchase supplies. The journey took 3 days on horseback through snow-packed trails. Lexington was the nearest town of any size, sitting in the valley where the mountains gave way to gentler country. The town served as a supply hub for the scattered mountain communities and the more established valley farms. The route took Elias past a large mill pond that had frozen solid. He had passed this pond dozens of times over the years, but on this particular February day, he stopped because he saw men working on the ice. There were 8 of them, cutting massive blocks from the frozen surface. They were ice harvesters, commercial operators who cut and stored ice during winter for sale during summer months. Ice harvesting was a profitable business in regions where natural ice could be obtained and stored in insulated ice houses. Elias had seen ice harvesting before, but had never paid it much attention. Now he watched with focused interest. The men worked with remarkable efficiency. They used long saws with unusual blade patterns, cutting through ice that was easily 2 feet thick. The saws moved smoothly through the frozen water. The cuts were clean and straight. blocks weighing several hundred pounds each, were freed in a matter of minutes. What struck Elias was the speed. These men were cutting through solid ice faster than he could cut through frozen wood with an axe. The material they were cutting was harder than wood, yet their progress was steady and seemingly effortless. The saws did not bind. The workers did not show the exhaustion that came from axe work. They cut, separated blocks, and moved them to a sledge with the rhythm of practiced efficiency. Elias dismounted and approached the work site. The foreman was a thick-shouldered man named Patterson, who looked at Elias with the suspicion Valley people often showed mountain folk. But when Elias asked direct questions about the ice saws, Patterson warmed to the subject. He was proud of his operation and happy to explain the tools. The saws were specialized equipment, Patterson said. They were not like wood saws. The teeth were spaced much wider, sometimes more than an inch apart. The angle was aggressive, designed to chip rather than shave. The blade was thick and rigid. Normal wood saws had fine teeth set close together. Those saws would bind immediately in ice because the kerf would fill with chips and freeze solid. Ice saws cleared the chips as they cut. Elias asked if the saws could cut anything besides ice. Patterson laughed. "They're ice saws. You use them on ice. Why would you cut anything else?" But he admitted he had never tried using one on wood. It simply was not what the tool was designed for. Elias spent an hour watching the harvest operation. He noticed how the saw teeth grabbed the frozen material and pulled chips free. He noticed how the wide spacing prevented binding. He noticed that the workers let the saw do the work rather than forcing it. The motion was steady and rhythmic, not the violent chopping of axe work. In Lexington, Elias found a tool merchant who stocked ice saws. The price was steep, nearly $20 for a quality blade. That was a significant portion of the money Elias had from his fur sales. A good axe cost $3. A cross-cut saw cost $8. Spending $20 on a specialized tool seemed excessive by any reasonable measure. The merchant asked what Elias planned to cut. Elias said he wanted to try it on timber. The merchant looked confused. "It's an ice saw, for cutting ice. If you want to cut wood, I can sell you a proper wood saw for half the price." Elias bought the ice saw anyway. He returned to his mountain cabin in late February. The cold had not broken. Snow still lay deep across the landscape. Elias took the ice saw to his woodpile and selected a frozen oak log. He positioned it carefully, thinking about how the ice harvesters had arranged their blocks. He set the saw teeth against the wood and pulled. The first attempts were clumsy. The blade wanted to skate across the frozen surface. Elias adjusted the angle, thinking about what Patterson had said. Let the teeth grab. Do not force. He tried again. This time the teeth bit into the frozen wood. Chips came free. The saw moved through the log. It was not fast at first. Elias was learning. But after 20 minutes of experimentation, he cut completely through a frozen oak log that would have taken an hour with an axe. His arms were tired but not exhausted. The saw blade showed no damage. Elias looked at the clean cut and thought about Thomas Kern. March and April brought gradual warming. The deep snow melted. The creeks ran high with spring runoff. Elias continued trapping and preparing for the next winter. He spent considerable time practicing with the ice saw on frozen wood while it was still available. Each session taught him something new about angle, pressure, and rhythm. By the time the last of the frozen logs thawed in late April, he had developed a technique that worked consistently. He said nothing to his neighbors about what he was doing. The practice sessions happened on his own property, away from commonly traveled paths. The ice saw stayed in his cabin, not displayed among his outdoor tools. Elias wanted to refine the method completely before exposing it to scrutiny. He knew mountain people well enough to predict their reaction to unconventional thinking. Summer passed with normal work. Elias cut timber for next winter's supply, tended a small garden, and made occasional trips to Lexington to trade. He purchased a second ice saw in August, reasoning that having a backup tool made sense if he planned to rely on the method exclusively. The merchant remembered him and asked how the first saw had worked. Elias said it worked fine and offered no details. Autumn brought preparation for winter. Elias stacked his cut logs near the cabin. He checked his tools and supplies. He made sure the ice saws were sharp and properly maintained. November arrived with early cold. The first snow fell on the 8th. By mid-November, temperatures were dropping below freezing at night. The logs in Elias's woodpile began to freeze. Henry Caldwell visited on November 20th. Henry lived 5 miles north along the ridge. He was a solid man in his 40s who had been in the mountains longer than Elias. He stopped by occasionally to share news or trade small items. On this visit, he noticed the ice saw leaning against Elias's cabin wall. Henry picked it up and examined it with obvious confusion. "This is an ice harvesting saw. Why do you have an ice harvesting saw?" Elias had known this conversation was coming eventually. He explained calmly that he planned to use it for cutting frozen wood during winter. The wide teeth and aggressive angle worked well on frozen timber. He had tested it extensively. It was faster and less exhausting than axe work. Henry stared at him. Then he laughed. It was not cruel laughter, but genuine amusement mixed with concern. "Elias, that is an ice saw. You use it on ice, not timber. You cannot just use any tool for any job. That is like trying to plow with a butter churn." Elias said he had tested it. It worked. Henry's amusement faded into worry. "Have you been injured? Hit your head? This does not make sense. Ice saws are for ice. Wood saws are for wood. Axes are for wood. This is basic knowledge." Word spread quickly through the small mountain community. Henry Caldwell mentioned Elias's strange plan to Jacob Sutter, who lived another 3 miles west. Jacob visited within 2 days, ostensibly to borrow a trap, but actually to see the ice saw himself. He examined it and shook his head. "Wasteful foolishness. You spent good money on a tool you will never use properly. When that saw breaks on frozen oak, you will wish you had saved your dollars for a proper axe." William McCrae heard the story at a community gathering in early December. He made a special trip to Elias's cabin to offer advice. "Your pride is going to get you killed. When that ice saw binds in a frozen log and snaps, you will have wasted your money and lost your tool. Then what? You cannot cut wood with a broken saw. You will freeze because you thought you were smarter than everyone who came before." The nickname emerged naturally from multiple conversations. Ice Saw Brennan. It was said with a mixture of amusement and pity. The general consensus among the scattered families was that Elias had made a foolish investment based on flawed thinking. Some thought he was desperate after Thomas Kern's death and had latched on to an irrational solution. Others thought he was simply stubborn and would learn his lesson when winter proved him wrong. Elias did not argue with any of them. He thanked them for their concern and continued his preparations. He knew that explaining the technique would accomplish nothing. Mountain people respected demonstrated results, not theoretical arguments. He would show them when the time came, or he would fail and accept their judgment. Either outcome would be determined by reality, not debate. The first deep freeze arrived on December 18th. Temperatures dropped and stayed below freezing day and night. The logs in Elias's woodpile froze solid within 48 hours. He began processing them systematically using his ice saw method. The technique he had developed required specific steps. First, position the log on 2 support pieces to elevate it off the ground. This allowed the saw to complete each cut without hitting earth or snow. Second, mark the cut line clearly. Frozen wood did not show saw marks as easily as normal wood, so planning each cut prevented waste. Third, set the saw teeth at a shallow angle, approximately 20 degrees from horizontal. This allowed the teeth to grab frozen fibers without skating across the surface. The cutting motion was steady and rhythmic. Pull the saw through the full length of the blade, letting the teeth do the work. Do not force downward pressure. The wide tooth spacing cleared chips. Naturally, The aggressive tooth angle chipped through frozen wood fibers the same way it chipped through ice. After 5 or 6 full strokes, the saw would establish a curve deep enough to guide itself. A frozen oak log, 12 inches in diameter, required approximately 15 minutes to cut completely through. The same log would take 45 minutes to an hour with an axe. December gave way to January 1844. The winter was proving harsh even by mountain standards. Snow accumulated steadily. Temperatures remained consistently below freezing. Every family burned firewood at rates that depleted carefully prepared supplies faster than anticipated. By mid-January, people were processing wood constantly just to maintain adequate heat. Elias worked near the frozen creek, methodically cutting through his supply of frozen logs. The ice saw performed exactly as he had expected. He processed wood in half the time his neighbors required using axes. He maintained his heat easily and still had substantial reserves. The physical toll was manageable. His shoulders and back ached from the repetitive motion, but it was nothing like the bone-deep exhaustion that came from swinging an axe against frozen timber for hours. From his position near the creek, he could occasionally see other cabins in the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin streams. Thin smoke meant fires burning low, either from lack of wood or attempts to conserve dwindling supplies. He sometimes saw neighbors working their wood piles, the distant sound of axes ringing against frozen logs, carrying across the cold air. No one came to observe his work. Pride prevented it. The men who had mocked Ice Saw Brennan were not going to admit curiosity by visiting to watch him prove or disprove his method. They worked their own supplies and dealt with their own challenges. That was the mountain way. Every man handled his own problems. On January 23rd, the weather changed dramatically. A cold front moved through that pushed temperatures far below anything the region had experienced in years. The cold was profound and penetrating. Water left in buckets froze solid within an hour. Breath crystallized instantly. Exposed skin went numb in minutes. And the cold persisted. Day after day, the temperatures remained brutally low. Firewood consumption doubled. Families that had been burning 1 large log per day now burned 2. Cabins that had been adequately warm now felt barely tolerable. Children and elderly people huddled near fireplaces wrapped in every blanket the households owned. And the men went out to cut more wood. But cutting wood in the extreme cold was nearly impossible with traditional tools. The frozen logs were harder than they had been earlier in winter. Axes bounced off with jarring impacts that accomplished almost nothing. Men swung until their arms trembled with exhaustion, making minimal progress. The physical effort generated body heat, which was beneficial, but it also depleted energy stores rapidly. Exhausted men made mistakes. Mistakes led to injuries. Henry Caldwell's situation became desperate by the end of January. His family consisted of his wife Sarah, 3 children aged 6 to 12, and himself. They had started winter with adequate wood supplies, but the prolonged cold and increased consumption had burned through more than Henry had anticipated. His remaining supply was entirely frozen. He spent 2 full days swinging an axe, accomplishing perhaps 4 hours' worth of normal cutting. His hands blistered, his shoulders seized, his progress was insufficient. Margaret Whitfield lived alone in a small cabin 4 miles from Elias's property. She was 67 years old, a widow whose husband had died 5 years earlier. Her son Robert lived in the valley, but visited monthly to help with heavy work. Robert had cut and stacked firewood for his mother in November, enough to last through winter under normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. Margaret's supply ran out on February 2nd. The last log went into her fireplace that morning. By afternoon, the cabin temperature was dropping noticeably. By evening, she was wearing every piece of clothing she owned and still shivering. She had no way to cut more wood herself. The logs stacked outside were frozen solid and far too heavy for her to move, much less split. Robert had been scheduled to visit on February 1st, but the extreme cold had made travel from the valley too dangerous. He was stuck waiting for temperatures to moderate. Margaret understood this. She did not blame him, but understanding did not keep her warm. By the morning of February 3rd, her cabin was barely above freezing. She was approaching a crisis. Henry Caldwell learned about Margaret's situation that afternoon. His wife Sarah had spoken with another neighbor who had seen Margaret's chimney producing no smoke. Henry faced a difficult decision. His own family was struggling. He had no wood to spare, but leaving an elderly woman to freeze was unacceptable. He needed help, and there was only one person in the area who seemed to have wood processing under control. Henry walked to Elias's cabin late that afternoon. The conversation was awkward. Henry had mocked Elias's ice saw method publicly. He had called it wasteful foolishness. Now he stood in Elias's doorway, asking for help, because his own traditional methods had failed. Elias listened without comment. When Henry finished explaining Margaret's situation, Elias simply nodded. He gathered his ice saw, put on his heavy coat, and told Henry to lead the way. They walked to Margaret's cabin in silence. The sun was already setting. They needed to work fast. Margaret's woodpile contained approximately 20 frozen logs, each 2 feet long and ranging from 8 to 14 inches in diameter. With axes in the extreme cold, processing that much wood would take 2 men at least 6 hours, probably longer. Henry knew this. He expected to work through the night. He was prepared to do it because Margaret needed the wood to survive. Elias positioned the first log on 2 support pieces he found near Margaret's chopping block. He marked the cut line with a piece of charcoal. He set his ice saw at the proper angle and began cutting. The saw moved through the frozen oak with steady rhythm. Chips fell away cleanly. The blade did not bind. Within 12 minutes, the log was cut completely through. Elias moved to the next log. Henry stood watching. He said nothing, but his expression shifted from skepticism to attention to something approaching amazement. By the time full darkness arrived, Elias had processed 8 logs. Margaret's cabin was warming. She had enough wood to last several days, enough time for Robert to make the journey from the valley once temperatures moderated slightly. Henry helped stack the cut wood near Margaret's door. The work was done in under 3 hours. With axes, they would still be swinging in the dark, exhausted and making dangerous mistakes. Henry finally spoke as they prepared to leave. "I will be damned. It actually works." Elias's response was quiet. Ice and frozen wood are not that different. The following day, Henry appeared at Elias's cabin. The conversation was direct. Henry asked to borrow the ice saw. He needed to process his own depleted wood supply. His family could not wait any longer. Elias handed him the saw and spent an hour teaching the technique. Proper log positioning, correct blade angle, steady rhythm without forcing. Let the teeth work. Clear the chips naturally. Henry took the saw home and spent the afternoon cutting through his frozen logs. The method worked exactly as Elias had demonstrated. Henry processed enough wood in 4 hours to last his family a week. His arms were tired but not destroyed. His hands were not blistered. He had not risked injury from a glancing axe blow. The difference between the ice saw method and traditional axe work was not marginal. It was transformative. Word spread through a different lens now. Henry told Jacob Sutter what he had witnessed at Margaret Whitfield's cabin. Jacob's initial skepticism gave way to practical interest. If the method worked as described, it solved a problem that killed people. Pride was less important than survival. Jacob traveled to Lexington during a brief warming period in mid-February and purchased his own ice saw. He returned and asked Elias to teach him the technique. William McCrae heard the accounts from both Henry and Jacob. He visited Elias in late February with a straightforward request. "Teach me how to use an ice saw on frozen wood." Elias spent an afternoon demonstrating. William practiced until he understood the rhythm. By early March, William was processing his own wood supply with efficiency that would have seemed impossible 2 months earlier. The technique spread organically. Men who had learned it mentioned it to others. Families struggling with frozen wood processing heard about the ice saw method and sought information. By the end of winter 1844, 5 families in the immediate area were using ice saws for wood cutting. The method was discussed at community gatherings not as ice saw Brennan's foolishness, but as the freeze-cutting technique, or simply the ice method. No one formally credited Elias with the innovation. That was not how frontier knowledge worked. Useful techniques became common property almost immediately. The origin mattered less than the utility. Elias was recognized as the person who had introduced the method, but the method itself was now simply part of how people survived mountain winters. Tool merchants in Lexington noticed an unusual trend. In the spring of 1844. Mountain men were purchasing ice saws with unexpected frequency. The merchants found this curious. Ice harvesting was not a mountain occupation, yet the demand was undeniable. By summer, 2 merchants were stocking ice saws year-round, specifically for mountain customers who requested them. The winter of 1844 to 1845 brought similar cold. The ice saw method was now established practice across the region. Men who had never met Elias Brennan were using techniques he had developed. The knowledge spread through informal networks that connected scattered mountain communities. A trapper mentioned it to a hunter. A hunter demonstrated it to a settler. A settler taught it to his neighbor. Within 2 years, the method had reached communities 50 miles away in multiple directions. The impact was impossible to quantify precisely. Mountain people did not keep detailed records of near disasters avoided or injuries prevented. But the evidence existed in subtle ways. Fewer men showed up at community gatherings with exhaustion-related injuries that had been common during previous harsh winters. Fewer families were forced to abandon their cabins midwinter due to inadequate firewood supplies. Fewer widows appeared in valley towns seeking shelter after their husbands died from winter accidents. The physics behind the method's success were straightforward once someone recognized them. Frozen wood and ice shared similar structural properties. Both were rigid materials that resisted fine-toothed cutting tools. Both required aggressive tooth angles that could chip rather than shave. Both benefited from wide tooth spacing that prevented binding. The ice saw had been designed specifically to handle these properties in frozen water. The same design worked equally well on frozen timber. The innovation demonstrated a broader principle about frontier survival. The most valuable solutions often came not from inventing entirely new tools, but from recognizing that existing tools could be applied in unconventional ways. Elias had not invented the ice saw. He had simply observed it being used effectively on frozen material and recognized that frozen wood was also frozen material. The logical connection was obvious once someone made it. But no one had made it before Thomas Kern died in the snow. Elias continued living in his mountain cabin through the 1850s and into the 1860s. He never married. He maintained friendly relations with his neighbors, but remained somewhat solitary by nature. He was known as a reliable man, competent and helpful when needed, but not particularly remarkable. The ice saw method was no longer associated with his name. It was simply how people cut frozen wood. He died in March of 1869 at the age of 58 from pneumonia following a late winter cold. He was buried in a small cemetery near the abandoned site of Thomas Kern's old cabin. His grave marker noted his name and dates, but made no mention of innovations or techniques. But across the Appalachian Mountains, in sheds and cabins scattered through remote valleys and isolated ridges, ice saws hung beside axes. Men teaching their sons how to process firewood demonstrated the freeze-cutting technique as common knowledge. The tool that had seemed useless had become standard equipment, and the method spread silently across the mountains, saving lives without fanfare, carved not in stone, but into the practical knowledge of people who survived because someone refused to accept that tradition was the only way.